Imagine a world where half of the young men in your town never return home. Imagine a single gunshot fired on a quiet summer morning in Sarajevo, sending ripples so vast that tens of millions of lives are torn apart. One bullet, one instant, and suddenly the entire 20th century takes a different shape. Perhaps your own great-grandfather was among them, a farm boy who left his fields, certain he would be home by Christmas, but who instead found himself buried in mud and fire. Perhaps your great-grandmother listened to the silence of empty streets, waiting for letters that arrived less and less often. The blood of those who stood in the trenches may flow, even now, quietly in your own veins. Tonight, I will guide you through the story of 4 years that transformed the modern world. 4 years that stretched from the streets of Sarajevo, where an heir to a throne fell, to the armistice morning of November 11th, 1918, when the guns finally fell silent. You will hear not only of generals and empires, but of ordinary souls who laughed, wept, and endured amid the storm of history. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let the noise of the present drift away. We are traveling back in time to a moment when humanity first faced a new kind of conflict. A war not of knights or cavalry charges, but of machines, trenches, and endless fire. A war both modern and merciless, where the world, as it had been, was quietly laid to rest, and a new century, haunted and reshaped, was born. Before the war, Europe breathed with a different rhythm. The year was 1914, and the continent seemed to be gliding through a golden summer. In the cities, electric trams hummed gently along cobblestone streets. Cafes spilled onto sidewalks, their little round tables crowded with cups of steaming coffee and folded newspapers inked with stories of politics, science, and art. The air was alive with the aroma of roasted beans, tobacco smoke curling upward, and the faint, metallic scent of machinery that promised a modern age. Walk a little further, and you would hear the faint clatter of horse-drawn carriages mixing with the newer rumble of automobiles. Women in long dresses walked arm in arm, parasols catching the sunlight, while men in bowler hats tipped them politely as they passed. Vienna waltzed to the music of Strauss. Paris sparkled with laughter and champagne, and London thrived with the hum of markets and theaters. It felt to many as if progress itself was unstoppable, an endless ascent into light. Beyond the cities stretched a quieter Europe. In the villages, mornings began with the tolling of church bells. Farmers guided their horses through fields of ripening grain, while children carried baskets of warm bread from the oven to their neighbors. The smell of fresh dough and wood smoke lingered in the cool dawn air. Flocks of geese waddled lazily down narrow lanes. At dusk, families gathered by candlelight, telling stories in voices softened by generations of repetition. Life was slow, familiar, anchored in the rhythm of the seasons. This was the world on the eve of the Great War, a world still believing in its own permanence. Yet behind the serenity, shadows stretched. Armies had grown larger than ever before. New weapons, machines of iron and fire, waited quietly in depots and arsenals. Most believed they would never be used on a grand scale. War, if it came at all, was thought to be swift, honorable, perhaps even cleansing. Few could imagine how deeply the earth itself would be scarred. And so, the golden summer of 1914 drifted onward. In Sarajevo, a young man named Gavrilo Princip rehearsed his steps with a pistol in his pocket, while in the palaces of Europe, kings and emperors prepared for yet another season of ceremonies and banquets. None knew how fragile their world truly was. Now, pause for a moment. Close your eyes. Picture your own bedroom, quiet and safe, your body sinking into the mattress. Then, imagine that when you awaken, you are no longer here. Instead, it is July 1914. The window beside you opens onto a different world, a warm summer breeze carrying the scent of horse stables, coal smoke, and roses from a garden tended with careful hands. You hear the distant clip-clop of hooves on stone, the ring of a bicycle bell, and the laughter of children playing in the square. Everything feels so ordinary, so calm. And yet, only weeks remain before this gentle music of daily life is shattered. The trams will be silent, their tracks twisted by shells. Cafes will empty as men trade cups of coffee for rifles. The villages will no longer smell of bread, but of smoke and grief. The bells of the churches will toll, not for weddings or Sunday gatherings, but for funerals. All of it, this living, breathing Europe, will soon be drowned in the thunder of artillery, the hiss of gas drifting across trenches, the cries of millions who will never return home. Take another slow breath, in and out. Feel yourself standing at that threshold, the last moment of innocence before a world collapses. This is where our journey begins. He was not born for war. He was born for dawns that smelled of rye and damp earth, for the lift of a wooden pail from the well, for the crunch of frost under boots that did not yet know marching. In the soft blue of a summer morning, his mother would slice a heel of bread still warm from the oven, press it into his palm, and say the same few gentle words she'd always said. Eat, Mikhailiku. Work is long, and bread is kindness. He would nod, because this was the rhythm of life, all steady, all known. Then came the paper, with its tidy black letters and the seal that shone like a coin. The village gathered under the bell tower. Names were called with a solemn echo, a ripple passing through the crowd like wind through barley. Mikhailo stood with the others, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the horizon that held the road to the city, to the barracks, to a new, unknown shape of time. The uniform itched. The boots were stiff. He learned the language of commands and the clatter of the mess tin, the taste of thin soup that warmed the belly but not the soul. At night, in the long wooden barrack that smelled of straw and tallow, boys from distant valleys sang the same old songs with different words. Laughter drifted up to the rafters and stayed there, like swallows reluctant to migrate. He wrote home by candlelight, his hand careful, the ink stubborn. Dearest Mama, do not worry. I am learning quickly. The sergeant is strict, but he says I am strong. The boots are heavy, but I will grow into them. I keep the little icon you gave me in my pocket. When I touch it, I feel you near. When the train came, it seemed endless. Boxcars groaning like tired cattle, smoke rolling from the locomotive and settling in their hair and coats. They climbed aboard, and the doors slid shut with a final hollow sound. The world, for a while, became the rhythm of steel upon steel, a lullaby of motion. Through cracks in the boards, they saw fields drift past, rivers bright as mirrors, stations where women waved kerchiefs and men lifted caps. He pressed a palm to the wood and whispered the names of the villages they passed, as if naming could keep them safe. The front was not a line. It was a landscape rearranged. Earth piled high into walls, timber bracing the sides, a floor of duckboards slick with mist. The trench breathed, in its way, exhaling smoke and damp and the sour closeness of many bodies. Somewhere beyond the gray parapet was another trench, nearly the same, where other boys, who were not so different, watched the same sky and wiped the same rain from their faces. The first shells came like weather no one had ever seen before. The air heaved, the ground leapt. Sound arrived as something with weight, a pressure that pressed into the bones. Mikhailo learned to count without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Then the long space between a whistling descent and the thud that woke the crows. Afterward came the quiet that was not quiet at all, a ringing, a shiver, the murmur of men finding their voices again. He found small ways to stay human. A scrap of soap saved for Sunday, a string tied around a battered spoon so it would not be lost, a neighbor's joke told too many times that somehow became funnier each night. He learned to recognize the smell of bread from the field kitchen before the kettle even steamed, yeast and hope rising together in the cold air. When the bread arrived, still warm, he would break the crust and hold it close to his face. For a few breaths, he was home. Letters came in fits and starts, always late and always right on time. His sister wrote in a round, careful hand, "Brother, the goose is fat this year. Yavor sold us a little sugar, though it was dear. Mother keeps your shirt folded on the chair. She says it will be ready when you come for it. Come soon, Misha. I have kept a story to tell you, and it is getting heavy." He smiled at that, at the notion a story might be something you could carry, something that could set you down if you didn't share it. So he wrote back, "Tell me the story in little pieces, Sofika. Put each piece at the end of your letter, like a candle in a long hallway. I will read them one by one and walk the light to the door of home." He learned faces in the trench, the way a sailor learns stars. Each one a fixed point in the moving dark. There was Petro, who played a harmonica with a dent in its side and made even sad songs sound like promises. There was Janko, tall and quiet, who could coax a flame from damp wood and would, without asking, empty half his canteen into your cup if your throat sounded raw. These friendships were not loud. They were the kind that sit beside you in silence and share a crust without counting. They were the kind that draw a blanket higher over your shoulder when the frost sharpens at dawn. Winter stitched itself into everything. The earth grew a crust the spade could not easily break. Breath smoked from mouths and hung over the trench like a low cloud. Even the rifles looked colder, their metal deepening to a darker sheen. On the night the calendar called holy, the frost was a kind of brightness. Somewhere down the line, a voice began to sing. Not a marching song, not an order, just a carol, thin at first, then thicker as other voices joined. Mikhailo did not know all the words, but the tune had traveled through his village every year he could remember. He closed his eyes and hummed along, very softly. Across the field, from the other trench, another tune rose. Different words, the same tenderness. There it was, two lights answering one another in a dark valley. At dawn, the guns held their breath. A handkerchief went up on a stick. Men who had spent months peering at each other through sights and periscopes now climbed out of the earth like cautious animals. Someone laughed, short and surprised, as if he had forgotten he could. They walked toward one another over frozen ground that sang under their boots. One step, another. Mikhailo went slowly, palms out, heart drumming. A Russian boy in a long greatcoat stopped a few paces away. His eyes were the color of wet bark. His cheeks were chapped raw. For a long moment, they simply looked. "Bread?" the boy asked, in a voice that lifted at the end, turning the word into a question and a hope at once. Mikhailo broke his loaf in half. The boy did the same. They traded pieces and stood there, chewing in the cold, steam from their mouths curling and mixing. The bread was the same on both sides, dense, a little sour, honest. The Russian, he said his name was Sergei, pulled something from his pocket, a small picture, its corners furred with wear, a woman with a scarf tied neatly beneath her chin. "Mama," he said, tapping the image. Mikhailo nodded and touched the icon in his own breast pocket. "Mama," he echoed. They stood a bit closer, the current of fear passing around them the way a river parts around two stones. Sergei hesitated, then reached into his coat again and brought out a pencil stub and a wrinkled card. He sketched quickly, sure-handed despite the cold. A farmhouse, a tree with heavy branches, a path turning back toward a door. He held it up, the smile a small crooked thing. Mikhailo, who drew only plow lines, laughed softly. Sergei tore the card in two and gave him half. "For luck," he said. They shook hands, gloved, awkward, careful, as if they were placing a sleeping child into a cradle. By afternoon, officers were walking the line again. The world remembered itself. The quiet folded and was put away. Men slid back into trenches with a last wave, a last glance. The guns exhaled. Snow leapt from the parapets with each concussion and drifted down into their collars. In the weeks that followed, the routine returned. The watchful nights, the mornings stitched together by tea, and the scratch of pens on paper. There were rumors of offensives, as one might whisper about storms. They are coming. They are not. They are upon us. He measured time not by calendars, but by small survivals. How many pairs of socks he had left that were not more whole than wool? How many matches kept dry in a jar? How many times the sun rose in a sky so clear it seemed to be made of glass? When fear came, it dressed plainly. It arrived not as a roar, but as a slow tightening, the body's quiet knowledge that something was moving in the field beyond the wire. He found that if he breathed in for a count of 4 and out for a count of 6, slowly, kindly, his heart could be convinced to follow the breath's example. He taught this to Petro, who said it felt like blowing on the coals of a fire that did not want to die. Breath by breath, they found a way to keep the ember of themselves alive. In a letter he never sent, because he could not yet say the words to anyone who would worry, he wrote, "Sometimes I dream of walking the road to our village with bare hands and no pack. I dream I am only a boy again, and the ground does not break apart when I step on it. When I wake, I practice remembering how the morning light falls across our table, the shape it makes on the wood, the dust that dances in the beam like snow that is not cold. If I can remember this clearly, I am not lost." There were small graces. A package arrived with a knitted scarf the color of hay. A chaplain lent him a pencil long enough to feel like wealth. One afternoon, when the sky turned that peculiar green before snow, he and Janko found a stray dog with a face like a fox and a tail that wagged as if it were new at the job. They named her Zoraya for the dawn she made in their corner of the trench, and gave her a place at the foot of the stove. She slept with her muzzle on Mikhailo's boot and made little noises as if she were chasing something gentle. There were losses, too. They came without speeches, without a frame big enough to hold them. A section changed shifts, and one face did not return. A bunk lay neat and untouched for days until someone needed the blanket. Grief in the trench learned to move quietly. It said very little. It touched a sleeve. It filled a cup. It kept watch so another could sleep for an hour. At night, men turned on their sides and wept into the wool of their coats so the sound would not carry. Spring, when it came, arrived through the nose first. Clay. Grass tearing itself free of the last crust of frost. Somewhere behind the lines, a plow turned a field, and the scent of wet earth rushed toward them like a rumor of a kinder world. The trench slumped, its walls softening, the duckboards giving a tired groan with each step. Michaelo took off his cap and let a few drops of rain find his hair. He closed his eyes. For a moment, it was simply weather again, with no intention. In these long months, his world grew both smaller and larger. Smaller, because his days were bounded by 2 walls of earth and a slice of sky. Larger, because he had learned what it meant to pass a cup along a line of hands until everyone had taken exactly 1 sip, to keep your own feet dry so you could carry a friend when he could not, to hold a silence with someone else and feel that the silence itself had weight and kindness. He thought often of the half-card in his pocket, the farmhouse, the tree, the path. In the corner, Sergei's pencil had left a faint smudge where a window would be. On nights when the wind dropped and the stars seemed to lean closer, he imagined a lamp lit in that window, a woman ladling soup into a bowl, the door standing open like a promise. He did not know where Sergei was now, whether their paths had crossed only for that one Sunday, that one brief thaw in a winter too long. He only knew that somewhere on the other side of the field, hands which had once broken bread with his might even now be tightening a scarf against the same wind. One evening, after a day of work parties and repair, he sat with Petro and Janko and the dog dozing at their feet. The harmonica started up, softly, a melody so simple it felt like something you'd always known but could not name until this moment. Mikhailo hummed along, his voice barely above breath. He remembered his sister's promise of the heavy story, the one she would unload piece by piece. He imagined opening a letter to find not words, but a pressed flower, a scrap of ribbon, a thumbnail of cloth from the hem of their mother's apron, little anchors to hold the heart still. He felt, in that small circle of sound and warmth, the shape of a truth that surprised him. It was possible to be frightened and brave at once, to be far from home and yet carried by it, the way a seed is carried by the husk that looks so thin and proves so strong. Months would go by. The road would turn and turn again. He would move to other stretches of the front where the soil was darker, where the villages wore different names, where the bells rang a slightly different note. But he would keep the same practices, the slow breathing that taught his heart the patient rhythm of a plow horse, the quiet counting of socks and matches, the habit of pressing a warm crust to his face before eating. He would keep Zoraya's memory tucked against his palm, the exact weight of her head when she slept. And he would carry the moment in the frost, 2 boys on a field, sharing bread in the thin, bright air, as if it were a small, clear stone in his pocket. He would touch it when the sky darkened, when the earth shuddered, when letters did not come. He would remind himself that even in a world that had, for a time, forgotten its own gentleness, there were hours when it remembered. There were hands that reached across the cold. So he breathed, in and out. He learned to sleep in slices and to dream in fragments that, taken together, resembled a whole life. And each morning, when the gray light seeped into the trench and men shifted under blankets, He would open his eyes to a world that had not changed, and yet could someday change again. He would touch the icon. He would fold the scarf close at his throat. He would stand quietly and begin another day, carrying with him the soft, steadfast knowledge that kept him human. The taste of bread, the sound of a familiar tune, the weight of a pencil line sketching a path that always, always turned toward home. The war did not live only at the front. It seeped into kitchens and classrooms, into bakeries and rail depots, into the habits of people who had never seen a trench. It changed the flavor of morning tea, the shape of evenings, the sound of footsteps on stairwells as letters were slid under doors. It rearranged the light in windows. In villages like Mikhailo's, the bell still rang at dawn, but its tone had thinned. Metal had been taken for shells, and the bell's throat spoke with a smaller voice. Mothers moved through rooms quietly, as if careful not to disturb a sleeping house, though the house was awake and listening for the postman's tread. Bread was sliced finer. Sugar metered out from a jar with a tapped spoon. A shawl pulled close at the neck in the early chill. Hands warmed over a stove that burned more sparingly than before. On the table, a letter, read a dozen times until the creases made their own map of comfort. "Eat, Sofika," their mother would say. "Work is long, and bread is kindness." The same words she had said to Mikhailo, now folded into the days of waiting. After chores, his sister joined the line outside the cooperative, a ribbon of women and children that stretched along the fence. They exchanged recipes for making a little seem like much, swapped news, who had received a card, who had not, who had heard the whistle of a train at an hour that made the heart rise and risk falling. A cart went by with sacks of flour that smelled faintly of damp. The driver touched his cap. The line stepped forward, half a pace. In towns and cities, the war wore a different suit. Trams still rattled and sparked, but their benches filled with uniforms, and their advertisements changed. Posters bloomed on walls in loud colors, urgent letters, buy bonds, knit socks, give copper and bells, join up, keep quiet, keep faith, keep producing. The language of everyday life shifted. For the duration, people said, as if time itself had been put into a uniform and ordered to stand a long watch. Women crossed thresholds they had been told were not meant for them. Factory gates opened at dawn to a tide of skirts and pinned-up hair. Lunch tins and sleeves rolled high. The air inside was a seasoned stew of oil and iron filings, hot metal, varnish, and the sweetness of cooling tea from the break table. Machines hummed a stern lullaby. A forewoman walked the rows, watchful, steady, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She checked gauges, measured powder by weight and by the way it settled in the scoop. Fingers learned new skills, feeding casings into presses, seating fuses with a twist that had to be exact, tying cloth bags of propellant like infants swaddled too tightly. The rhythm lodged in the body. It said, "You are capable, you are careful, you are part of a long chain of hands." At lunch, these women spoke softly of wages that never stretched as far, of boots for growing children, of husbands or brothers or sweethearts whose letters smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. Sometimes they laughed at something small and good, someone's lopsided jam tart, a story of a cat that refused to be moved from a warm windowsill. A tune hummed off key until it gathered others into key. They learned to read the factory's moods. When the floor boss's footsteps quickened, when the delivery lorry was late, when silence fell, that meant the news sheet had brought numbers no one wanted to see. They measured their days, not just in hours, but in output, in lines ticked on a chalkboard, pieces completed, pieces safe, pieces that might be turned into safety for someone far away. Not all the work was in factories. In hospitals scrubbed with lye, the scent of carbolic lifted and bit the inside of the nose. Nurses unfurled bandages like pale flags, poured broth into cups, sponged foreheads, learned how to look at pain without flinching, and also without letting it pass through them entirely. On laundry days, sheets snapped like sails in a courtyard. In wards at night, someone always read aloud. Letters from home, a poem, a list of football scores from before the world rearranged itself. The men listened with their eyes closed, not to the words themselves, but to the human shape of a voice in a room where machines ticked and the air trembled with careful quiet. Everywhere, war reached into schools. Desks with their carved initials waited for boys who would not come back to carve more. The new students, shoulders not yet wide, learned arithmetic with different examples. If a regiment marches at this pace, how long to reach the railhead? If a ration is divided among so many, what remains? Teachers spoke with a soft authority, as if their words might keep the walls up. The playground made room for absence. A ball rolled to a stop at a hedge where it used to be kicked back. The newspapers became instruments tuned to a purpose. Headlines swelled and subsided like tides. Fonts grew bolder when battles were named. Maps appeared with arrows and hatchings, rivers like veins and borders like scars. Editorials told readers where to place their hope. They taught people how to feel: steadiness, endurance, righteous anger at the enemy, gratitude for sacrifice, pride in production. They offered images of the foe that smudged humanity until it was barely recognizable. Heavy brows, cruel mouths, so the heart would move in one direction only. A little cartoon doing a large job. Yet in the quieter corners of the paper, there were lists, names, ages, units, places last seen. These columns were read with lips pressed thin, fingers tracing letters as if they could be coaxed back into voice. The postman became a kind of priest of fate. He moved along streets with a leather bag that grew heavier and lighter by turns, each house an altar where joy or grief could alight. His knock could be a blessing or a blow. He learned to keep his eyes gentle, his hat in his hand. He knew which doors could bear no more, and saved those letters for last, as if the day itself might soften their edge. Sometimes, returning home in the blue hour, he sat on his own steps and rubbed his hands together a long time before opening his own post. A card from a nephew at the front with the printed phrases of a field post. "I am well. I have received your parcel. Do not worry." And the single penciled word that meant everything: warmly. Casualty lists multiplied. The town square hosted ceremonies more often than dances. Bunting was packed away, black ribbon raised in its place, windows filled with photographs, sons in their best shirts, fathers with stiff collars, boys with ears that stuck out endearingly from under caps. Churches rang thin bells for funerals and thick silence for the many for whom no coffin came. Women learned to step sideways around grief when they needed to fetch water or mend a shirt, and to open themselves to it when the house was quiet, letting it pass through like weather. Men missing from workshops meant girls learned to plane wood and fix a hinge and sign their name on the line where a man's name had always been expected. In some places, bells themselves were removed, lowered with ropes like cows being gently hauled out of a ditch. Metal for war, The empty towers spoke in wind. Village greens gave up their iron railings, and fences wore gaps like missing teeth. Children learned games with new rules, collecting scrap, stamping on dandelions because someone said their fluff clogged drains. And drains must run clear for ambulances. War taught thrift that bordered on invention. Soap was shaved thin, candles cut in two, a skirt turned into two blouses, then into rags, then into braided rugs that made cold floors kinder. Propaganda threaded through all of this like a firm stitch. It was a set of promises and a set of warnings. A poster might show a stout mother and her cheerful brood under words that said, "Your work feeds him," meaning the soldier whose silhouette marched across the top. Another might show a sharp-eyed foe peering over a wall. Careless talk costs lives. Songs in music halls made choruses of duty and jokes of danger because jokes were also a kind of duty. In cafes, men argued with their hands about maps, about the virtues of generals none of them would ever meet, about the outcome sure to arrive by Christmas, then by spring, then by next winter, then by best not to say. Waiters learned to collect cups soundlessly, to offer more coffee at exactly the moment a voice broke. Censorship rearranged the shape of letters. Lines blacked out like lanes closed by snowdrifts. We are positioned near, and then nothing, a canyon of ink. People learned to read around the absences, to treat the censored line as a pause where another emotion could be poured. In the bars of these gaps, a new literacy bloomed. How to hear what was not written. How to lean on the single adjective a soldier dared to add. How to weigh the liveliness of a hand against the stiffness of a script that might be penned by someone else. In the countryside, the work of food kept the body of the nation from growing faint. Fields that had once known the measured pace of horses now felt the growl of engines when fuel could be spared. Plows cut straighter to save time. Seed was counted like coin. Weather was followed the way people once followed court scandals. Rain was both friend and saboteur. Wheat stood and fell and rose again under winds that did not care for war's schedules. Women learned the balance of a scythe, the patient geometry of stacking sheaves. They became experts in the eloquence of clouds. Loss did not arrive in one piece. It came as a series of adjustments. A place at table left unlaid, because to lay it would invite a hope that woke too easily. A pair of boots kept polished in a corner for longer than anyone would admit out loud. Laughter that felt disloyal until someone said no. Laugh. He would have liked that. Memorials were improvised. A ribbon tied to a tree. A stone placed on a windowsill. A shelf made from a crate that held letters and a lock of hair and the pipe that still smelled faintly of sweet tobacco. Grief taught people the art of carrying. They grew strong in strange places. And yet, even as sorrow widened its rooms, the world found ways to stay tender. A schoolmaster started a club where children wrote to soldiers who had no one to write to them. "Dear friend, we played marbles today, and I lost them all. Dear friend, it snowed, and we put out a pan to catch it." Women at the factory added a small extra to a parcel. A square of chocolate, a scrap of bright ribbon, a pressed flower. Old men, too old to be called, leaned their chairs against shop fronts and whittled spoons for the soup kitchens, breathing out sawdust that smelled like the work of their fathers. Choirs sang. Hands were held. Babies were born and named after the missing, and the sound of those names in new voices built a bridge people could walk across on days when the river ran too high. All the while, far from the factories and the bread lines, and the squares with their flags lowered to half. There were rooms where war wore another sort of face, a chateau taken for headquarters, its mirrors veiled against blast, its parquet floors scuffed by boots too practical for such wood, maps unrolled on tables, pins pricked like constellations nobody wished upon. Telephone lines thrummed. Clerks sharpened pencils to a hopeful point. Orderlies moved in straight lines that turned into diagonals when a door opened unexpectedly. Lunch was soup and thick slices of meat and bread cut without measuring. Outside, a cook fed a fire that burned steadily, its smoke a faithful column. Cars came and went with tires that crunched on gravel, an elegant sound. Inside, men in polished boots traced arrows on paper with rulers, while at the front, boots sank into clay that remembered every step and did not easily give them back. This was not hypocrisy so much as distance. Numbers in columns did not weep. The map did not show the places where a trench dipped for a tree root, or where a dead mule made a smell that occupied a whole morning. Signals did not carry the way wind carried a song down the line on a cold night. And yet, sometimes, the distance narrowed. An officer stood at a dugout entrance and listened to a private explain, very carefully, that this quiet here was not the good kind, but the kind that meant something was crouching behind it, ready to break. The officer, who ate stew from a hot bowl at noon, understood this lesson and carried it back to the room with the maps like a seed cupped in the hand. Not all officers were careful. Some spoke a language of timetables and honor that refused to learn new words. Orders moved along wires and roads until they arrived where mud and breath and bread governed. The men in the trench shrugged into their packs, weights calibrated not by doctrine but by how far a back could carry, and went over. Later, a report would say the line had been taken, or held, or lost, that reinforcements had arrived or been delayed, that casualties were within expectations. Expectation became a merciless arithmetic, its decimals tugging on the ankles of sleep. In the street, a woman counted the differences between a queue that moved and one that only breathed. But there were other moments, too. A captain who had learned the topography of his men's faces found a way to plead for a delay long enough for the mist to thicken by an hour, and that hour, just fog and a patient tick on the clock, became the difference between a name on a list and a voice at roll call. A quartermaster risked the caution of his superiors and diverted a wagon load of dry socks to a sector where Trenchfoot had started to extract its quiet toll. A colonel wrote a letter to a widow in a hand that trembled openly and said the boy had died with decency, which was as close to gentleness as the language of war could get when it dressed itself as official. Meanwhile, back at the factory, the end-of-shift whistle was a wind that moved people into the street. Women walked home in threes and fours, their talk flowing and pooling at corners where they parted. The river beside the works caught the last light. In small flats, kettles sang. Children pulled chairs close to tables. Someone read a letter aloud and left out the worst sentence because leaving it out was a way of keeping it at bay. Someone else unfolded a newspaper and quickly folded it again, as if the news could be contained by neatness. On stairwells, people made room for one another without words. Good nights were exchanged like coins in a dark hallway, small and sufficient. The longer the war ran, the deeper its grooves became. Ration cards turned into calendars. Scarcity baked itself into recipes that future generations would call traditional, and not know their origin was a kind of love under pressure. Theaters found ways to keep curtains rising. Laughter was rationed too, but not forbidden. At the end of a performance, an actor would step into the light and speak plainly. Give what you can to the fund for blankets, for boots, for bandages, for the men whose hands still hold the line. Coins fell like rain into buckets, held by girls whose cheeks were painted pink because the world needed color badly, and makeup was cheaper than roses. Some nights were disturbed by sirens that rode a zigzag in the dark. Curtains were pulled, candles snuffed. People learned the geography of their cellars. They sat shoulder to shoulder beneath their houses and spoke softly, because softness is contagious. Afterward, they climbed the stairs and stepped out into streets that smelled of dust. Neighbors swept thresholds and checked on old women who pretended not to need checking on. A cup of tea made in the worst cup in the house tasted like a treaty. And then, because history is not a single drumbeat but a braid, there were movements in the streets, protests when bread ran out, voices that said the war had eaten enough, others that shouted them down. The fabric of a society tested its own seams and found some strong, some ready to give. The state, wary, watched. The church prayed. The shopkeepers kept their shutters up as long as they could and lowered them when they must. The river went on moving in its bed, indifferent and faithful. Through all of it, the line between home and front remained a wire humming with messages, parcels traveling one way with socks and sweets, and a line in a mother's hand that said, "Sleep warm if you can." Letters traveling the other, with a pressed leaf, a postcard of a town where the station clock had survived, a joke about the cook's stew, a sketch of a dog named Zariah who had decided to belong to the trench. Each object was a small raft, a float on a current stronger than anyone could swim, carrying the human across. If you listen, even now, you can hear the two worlds answer each other. A hammer's tap on a factory jig, a mallet's thud on a duckboard pin, a kettle's boil in a kitchen, a mess tin singing when it meets a spoon, a church choir practicing an anthem, men in a dugout humming along without knowing why the tune has come to them. The distance is large, the distance is small. Both are true. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe in and out. Imagine Sofika pinning a postcard above the table. An ordinary picture of a bridge over a small river, sent by a boy who has seen too much water and too little of home. Imagine the forewoman counting her girls at the end of shift and saying gently, "Go. Rest your hands." Imagine the postman's careful knock, the silence that follows, the deep breath taken on the other side of the door. Imagine the officer, for once, putting his ruler down and closing his eyes and seeing not a map but a field and two boys sharing bread on a frost-bright morning. This is the world that held the men at the front, the world they carried in pockets and hearts. It is the world that suffered and adapted and kept itself from breaking by making, by mending, by remembering gentleness even when the air itself seemed sharpened. It is where Mikhailo's letters were read aloud, where his name was spoken softly into rooms so it would not drift too far, where a bowl of soup was set at the window on a cold night, as if heat itself could travel the long road and arrive at his hands. And it is where, when the time came, the sound of peace would be first a rumor, then a murmur, then a bell finding its voice again, thin at first, then fuller, calling people into the streets where they would stand, blinking in a light that felt new and old at once, and count the living, and remember the dead, and begin the next work, making a world suitable for sleep. From Mikhailo's narrow slice of sky, widen the lens. Imagine the map of Europe on a wooden table, its borders like threads pulled tight. The summer of 1914 was warm and ordinary until, on June 28th, in Sarajevo, an heir to a throne was shot. The pistol's crack was brief. The echo was long. Diplomats drafted notes. Telephones clicked. Ultimata were sent and answered and sent again. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Russia stood behind Serbia. Germany offered Austria-Hungary a blank check. France readied itself beside Russia. Britain watched the Belgian frontier, a promise in its pocket. In a few hurried weeks, the July crisis, the old order walked into a new kind of fire. Germany moved first, a vast wheel turning through neutral Belgium toward France, a plan rehearsed on paper for years. Britain entered the war to honor Belgium and to balance power. The armies met and discovered that modern firepower outpaced old ideas. In early September, at the Marne, east of Paris, something important happened. French and British forces checked the German advance and pushed it back. Taxis ferried troops. Bridges were held. The river became a boundary between "it will be over by Christmas" and a long war measured in winters. The first trench lines were dug. The earth became a defense and then a home. From the North Sea to the Swiss frontier, men disappeared into corridors of clay. The Western Front settled into a stalemate that was not stillness, but a grinding match of supply, endurance, and invention. Machine guns scissored open ground. Barbed wire turned fields into traps. Artillery, more than any single weapon, ruled the war. Volume, weight, and patience made into thunder. New methods tried to tame it. Creeping barrages that inched forward like a moving curtain, sound ranging and flash spotting to find the hidden guns. In 1915, at Ypres, a greenish cloud drifted across no man's land. Chlorine gas, a terrible chemistry lesson. Masks appeared, new gases followed. Each answer prompted a harder question. Yet the war was not the same everywhere. On the Eastern Front, distance defeated the certainty of trenches. Armies advanced and retreated over wide plains. Towns changed hands. The line breathed. In 1916, Russia's General Brusilov launched an offensive that struck with speed and planning seldom seen. For months, the Austro-Hungarian front bent and tore. Gains were real, at great cost. The strain showed what the war was doing to empires built from many peoples, languages, and loyalties. Even success grew heavy when supply could not keep pace with hope. In the West, that same year, two great names became quiet synonyms for endurance: Verdun and the Somme. At Verdun, beginning in February 1916, Germany sought to drain French strength around a ring of forts and ravines. "They shall not pass," the French vowed. For nearly 10 months, the ground was fought over ridge by ridge, wood by wood. The battle's measure was not miles gained, but the refusal to let a city become a memory. To relieve pressure, the British and French attacked on the Somme in July. On the first day, hope met the modern defense with terrible results. By the autumn, both sides had learned and adapted, but the price remained high. Here, for the first time, tanks crept forward, slow, ungainly, mechanical answers to wire and guns. They broke ground as much in imagination as in soil. At sea, a quieter war threatened to decide the louder one. Britain's blockade tightened a belt around the Central Powers. Merchant ships logged longer routes. Cargoes were inspected and sometimes turned away. German U-boats prowled the lanes in reply, their periscopes brief punctuation in gray water. When unrestricted submarine warfare returned in 1917, it pushed neutral patience past its limits. Convoys, escorts, and new devices like depth charges changed the balance. Across the Atlantic, a democracy that had watched and weighed its choices reached one. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The decision was not a door that opened in an instant, but the hinge that would, over months, swing weight toward the Allies. American industry retooled. The American Expeditionary Forces organized and crossed. Fresh divisions learned a landscape already carved by years of experience. That same year, the Eastern Front story turned sharply. Russia, bleeding from long campaigns and internal strain, overthrew its czar in February. March, new style. Hopes for reform met the hard arithmetic of war and hunger. In October, November, new style. The Bolsheviks seized power, promising peace and land. In early 1918, Russia stepped out of the war at Brest-Litovsk, signing a treaty that redrew maps and freed German divisions to move west. But leaving a war is not the same as ending one. Russia entered years of civil conflict that would make a different future. With the East quieted, Germany gambled. In the spring of 1918, before American strength could fully arrive, it launched a series of offensives along the Western Front. Stormtrooper tactics, short, fierce bombardments, infiltration through weak points. Gains were real. Rivers and roads that had long been behind the line felt the war at their doors, but the cost was high, the reserves finite, and supply lines long. By summer, momentum faltered. At the Second Marne, French, British, and now American units stood, then counterattacked. Tanks, no longer isolated, worked with infantry and aircraft in teams. Artillery talked to airplanes by wireless to spot and correct. The front bent the other way. What followed is often called the 100 Days, a series of Allied offensives that pressed, advanced, and pressed again, not with sudden romance, but with learned coordination. Railways feeding guns, workshops feeding railways, farms feeding workshops, until the German command recognized that the line and the nation behind it could no longer bear the load. On November 11th, 1918, at the 11th hour, the guns became memory. The armistice did not erase the trenches from the earth or the war from the body, but it allowed silence to climb back into the sky. Men listened to it as if it were a new instrument. Bells, long muted or thin, found their voices and rang. Pause here. Breathe. Let the names settle. Sarajevo, Marne, Verdun, Somme, the Brusilov offensive, American entry, the Russian Revolution. Each one is both an event and a lesson in how modern war gathers whole societies into its work. Because that is what changed. This was not only armies colliding, it was nations reorganizing themselves around the collision. A total war, not in the sense that all was destroyed, but that all was engaged. Governments mobilized not just soldiers, but steel and coal, harvests and horses, chemists and code clerks. Railways became arteries, timetables, a kind of scripture. Rationing entered kitchens. Factory whistles set the day's pulse. Posters taught ideas of duty in bright, simple strokes. Civilians were not the target in the way the next war would make them, but they were not untouched. By blockade, by bombardment from the air at the edges of the front, by absence, by lists. Empires leaned on their colonies and dominions. Men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond marched beneath flags that were and were not their own. The war's circle widened until it was a belt around the world. Technology did not merely decorate this conflict, it structured it. The machine gun made open ground a calculation. Barbed wire turned movement into puzzles. The field telephone and wireless carried orders and allowed guns to speak across miles. Aircraft began as eyes, reconnaissance, photography, mapping the texture of trenches and the rhythm of trains, and then grew into fighters and bombers, a new dimension with its own aces and losses. Tanks took shape from an agricultural idea, tracks that would not sink into soft soil, and rolled into doctrine, supporting infantry, bridging fear. Poison gas, a terrible crossing of laboratory and battlefield, forced masks onto faces and time into every plan. Camouflage, once the art of hunters and painters, became a science. Nets, paint schemes, dummies, and decoys. Medicine adapted, triage refined, antisepsis improved, blood transfusion expanded. The language of shell shock groped toward an understanding that the mind too can be wounded. Each innovation was a rung on a ladder that no one wanted to climb, and yet up it went, step by step. When did the war stop being a short affair and become what it was? Many would point to the Marne, where movement slowed and trenches began. Others to the moment when casualty lists outgrew the newspaper columns that once held them. Or when Christmas 1914 passed and the men still looked at the same gray parapet. Perhaps it was when the first gas cloud moved and men understood that even air could be turned into a weapon, or when tanks appeared and the ground itself seemed to learn to move. More quietly, it may have been when ration cards slid into purses, when women in factories measured powder with hands that used to measure flour, when the poster on the wall taught children a vocabulary of war. A short war cannot ask this much of so many for so long. By 1916, the phrase had become a memory. People repeated the way one touches a bruise to check if it still hurts. The war ended. It did not vanish. Armistice opened a long room called peace, and inside it, negotiations, hopes, and edges. In 1919, the victors met in Paris to draw documents that would draw new lines. On June 28th, exactly 5 years after Sarajevo, the Treaty of Versailles was signed with Germany in the Hall of Mirrors, a deliberate circle. Versailles limited the German army, demanded reparations, and placed war guilt in a clause that would be read and reread with gathering bitterness. Other treaties dismantled the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. New states appeared or reappeared: Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, the Baltic states. Finland stood apart. Borders in the Middle East shifted into mandates that would become futures of their own. The League of Nations was born, a first attempt at a forum where disagreement might use words first. It would be earnest, and it would be insufficient. Veterans brought the front home in their bodies and dreams. Some found new purpose. Many searched. Monuments rose in town squares, names carved in stone, sometimes with more than one surname from the same house. Ceremonies of remembrance took shape. The unknown soldier laid to rest, poppies pinned, a silence kept at the 11th hour. Laws changed. In several countries, women who had carried industry and family through war gained the vote. Science and engineering stepped into the civilian world with new speed. Radios in parlors, engines in fields, techniques learned in scarcity applied to peacetime abundance. And yet, the settlement's weaknesses were real. Economic strains, political resentments, and unresolved national questions remained like embers under ash. In the 1920s and 1930s, storms gathered. Inflation that made money feel like paper again. Movements that promised order at the cost of liberty. Leaders who spoke to anger and shaped it into something hard. The next war would not repeat the last exactly, it would answer it. In this sense, the First World War was both an ending and a prologue. It closed an age of empires and opened an age of nations. It buried an older kind of war and taught the mechanics of a new one. It wrote, "Never again," into many hearts, and then, heartbreakingly, showed how fragile that sentence can be. Return, for a last moment, to Mikhailo's trench, and to the rooms where letters were read. The great movements of history, Sarajevo to Marne, Verdun to the Somme, Brusilov to the armistice, Russia's revolutions, America's arrival, treaties and borders, passed through individual lives like weather through open windows. The wind stirred the same curtains. The maps on conference tables were far from the bread lines and the duck boards, but lines drawn there determined where trains would run, where a bell would ring again, where a child would grow up speaking one language or another. Breathe in and out. The guns are quiet now in this telling. The lessons remain. That modern war draws whole societies into its gravity. That technology is not neutral once unleashed. That peace must be made with care as well as signed with ink. Let the names turn from iron to water and flow away, leaving behind a clearer shore. We will walk there gently in the next part of our story, toward escalation and release, and then slowly toward rest. By 1916, the calendar had lost its edges. Days no longer separated cleanly. They bled into one another, like ink into damp paper. The war's great engines turned, and somewhere inside their grinding teeth, a single life like Mikhailo's tried to keep its own rhythm. Wake, watch, mend, write, breathe. He could tell the hour by the temperature of the tea, by the density of the fog in the communication trench, by how the duckboards complained underfoot. Time did not pass. It pooled. "It feels," he wrote home, "as if the clock has hung itself on a nail and refuses to swing." Beyond his narrow slice of sky, the world heaved. At Verdun, the ground learned the language of refusal. At the Somme, hope walked into wire and met the mathematics of a machine age. Names that once belonged to farms and woods became measures of endurance. Ridge, copse, spur. The trench took the news without expression. It asked the same things of a man on a quiet day as on a loud one. Keep the water out. Keep the feet dry. Keep the matches safe. Keep the heart from breaking its own pace. In the long months, the war taught small rituals that made an hour habitable. Mikhailo wrapped his scarf twice around his neck and pressed the wool against his mouth when the air stung. He counted his breaths, 4 in, 6 out, until the count itself became a frame strong enough to hold a tremor. He polished a spoon with the corner of a rag until it shone. He warmed it between his palms before eating, as if courtesy could be extended to metal. He rubbed Zoraya's old collar when the wind turned wicked and told himself, without quite believing it, that dogs always find their way back. In 1917, the seasons wobbled. The air tasted different, hungrier somehow. Rumors arrived with the mail. Shortages in the cities. Winter coal stacked thin. The queue outside the cooperative like a ribbon that never quite reached its bow. Men returning from leave spoke of strikes. Workers closing their hands around a day and keeping it, insisting the body must also be fed. And of women who had turned factories into villages that could cough out miracles. Shells measured to the grain. fuses set by fingers that once plaited hair. Morale, people said, as if it were an item that could be inventoried alongside shells and boots. In some sectors, men refused a tax that looked like yesterday with a new date. They did not run. They simply would not climb when the sky promised nothing but subtraction. Officers who listened learned to measure courage not only in yards taken, but in trenches held against rain and rot and the ache that says, quietly, enough. Orders adapted in places where ears were open. Elsewhere, timetables refused to learn mercy. The food at the front grew thinner in spirit, if not in portion. A stew could be hot and plentiful, and still taste like absence. Letters spoke of bread, made with more imagination than flour. A newspaper, tucked into a parcel, carried a headline large enough to fill a wall, and beneath it, in smaller type, names stacked and stacked. Mikhailo read them with the respectful attention one gives to the dead, and then folded the paper into a cushion for someone's aching back. Even grief needed something soft. The weather staged its own campaigns. In summer, dust found the throat and settled there like an argument. Autumn returned the mud, patient and thorough, easing under the edges of boots, demanding socks and time and attention. Winter sharpened everything until it sang. On guard at night, Mikhailo felt the stars step closer, cold and exact. He thought of Sergei's penciled farmhouse, the window smudged into possibility, and wondered where the other half of that card had traveled, whether it warmed any pocket, whether the hand that drew it had been spared or spent. The front shifted like a tired sleeper. In Flanders, men moved and sank and moved again. The names Ypres and Passchendaele became not just places, but textures. Mud that could swallow a boot, a man, a promise. In the east, the line breathed wider. Revolutions unfolded like sudden weather that had been forming for years. The news was a tangle of arrows and proclamations that no one could quite smooth out. In hospital wards, scrubbed to a gleam, nurses learned the weight of silence. In chapels, prayers acquired new verbs. On factory floors, women worked by the clock and by the ache in their shoulders. On village greens, bells rang thinner, if they rang at all. Through it all, Mikhailo held to the things that made daylight climb the wall of the dugout with some decency. He insisted on washing, even when the water was a memory. He kept a tally of jokes, old ones, told badly, that improved with repetition. He learned the names of the birds that dared the wire, larks that seemed to be made of nothing but light and sound. He taught a new boy from a far valley how to pace his fear with breath, and the boy, in return, taught him a hymn that could be hummed so softly it did not disturb even a sleeping rat. Between barrages, they repaired shelves and wrote letters and mended socks with a kind of devotion that made small things large. By early 1918, the war had the look of a long room with many doors opening at once. German guns opened first, short storms instead of long ones, then men moving quickly through the weather those guns made. The line bent. Maps at headquarters relearned the geometry of movement. In dugouts and on fire steps, the air changed in a way that had nothing to do with wind. You could feel a push coming, the way you feel thunder shift the pressure in your ears. Mikhailo and Petro checked straps, counted cartridges, set aside superstition long enough to make certain their kit did not betray them for want of a simple fastening. No one said, "This is the one," but the body knew. They met the spring offensives as they had met every season, with stubbornness, with teamwork, with the quick arithmetic of survival. Positions lost at noon were held at dusk. Lines that seemed to run like water stiffened overnight. Rations arrived late and tasted of their journey. Messages arrived early and changed twice before they were read. New accents joined the chorus on the line. Americans with wide shoulders and a way of greeting you that felt like a handshake even when you were too far apart to reach. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, their energy startling. They learned quickly, and they brought with them a sense that the future might yet be made of choices rather than of consequences only. The sky grew busy. Aircraft droned like insects with intentions. Observers leaned over the rims of the world and spoke to guns by wireless. Flares wrote quick sentences in the air and were answered by other sentences, understood by men whose lives depended on fluent reading. Tanks came not as miracles, but as members of a team, no longer solitary beasts, bogged in doubts, but companions to infantry, to gunners, to sappers who felt for the bones of the earth. Somewhere in this choreography, the trench's clock creaked on its nail, and for the first time in a long while, moved. Mikhailo felt it the way a farmer feels spring inside his hands before the first real thaw. He did not name it. Names could break good luck. He simply noticed that when he closed his eyes after a night shift, the sleep that came was more complete, less concerned with ambushes poised just inside a dream. He woke, ate the bread he always warmed against his face first, and found that it smelled a little more like the oven at home and a little less like travel. Resolution autumn approached as a kind of exhale. The Allied line did not surge so much as lean forward and keep leaning. Village by village, spur by spur, a learning made manifest. Railways fed the push. Workshops fed the railways. Fields fed the workshops. And underneath it all, the patience of men who had been teaching themselves how to be patient for years continued to hold. Reports from the rear began to include words that tasted new on the tongue. Advance, liberate, breakthrough. In the cities that had waited so long, crowds found their voices even before the papers confirmed anything. As if joy itself had become a kind of rumor people were finally willing to trust. In the trench, caution persisted. Mikhailo checked every step, as if the earth might still decide, out of habit, to swallow him. Yet there were changes. The mail ran more regularly. The stew tasted slightly less of tin. A chaplain read a letter from some high place and did not need to raise his voice. Men heard it because something inside them had unclenched. At dusk, the horizon looked less like a closed door and more like a road. On a cold morning in November, a word traveled down the line that no one had practiced saying, armistice. It moved from mouth to mouth like a small flame shielded by hands. The hour was named so precisely it felt sacred. 11 on the 11th day of the 11th month, and the precision itself steadied them. They worked as usual until the last minute, because work was what kept the world together. Then, when the hand on someone's wristwatch met its promised place, the guns laid down their voices. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is a sound with its own shape. It soaked into coats and sandbags, drifted down the communication trenches. Filled rooms no one had noticed were empty. Birds, startled, arranged themselves back into song. Men looked at one another as if they had woken in a house where a baby had finally fallen asleep. Some laughed. Some wept. Most simply sat and listened until listening felt complete. Mikhailo took the half-card from his pocket and considered, for a long time, the smudged window where a lamp might be. The space around the drawing seemed larger than it had the day before, as if quiet could add square footage to paper. Going home, it turned out, was not a straight line. The army, which had learned to move men in their millions, now learned the different art of unmaking a war. Papers had to be stamped, boots turned in, rifles handed over like tools after a harvest. The trains returned not with the breathless forward lean of mobilization, but with the patience of winter traffic. Stations where men had once leapt down to form up now became places to sit and remember how to wait without scanning for orders. On a platform in a town with a new flag, Mikhailo watched a woman tie a ribbon around a parcel and pass it to a stranger. He heard children practicing a song about peace without being entirely sure what peace was made of. He saw a man in uniform hesitate before entering his own house, as if the threshold had become a test. He felt the earth beneath the platform through his boots and told his body quietly that it did not need to brace anymore each time a whistle blew. The world had shifted while he was away. Empires that had gathered many languages under one roof were now piles of timber being sorted into new houses. Old coins did not buy what they used to. New coins looked too clean. Newspapers were full of maps that seemed to invent new neighbors. In markets, people argued gently about what to call things, and then, because bread must be bought and soup must be salted, they called them something and got on with it. Churches rang bells that had been silent, their voices tentative, then fuller. In the corner of a cafe, a fiddle played a tune that had not been safe to play for a while. Men stood in doorways and tried out the shape of hope as if it were a coat from a different season. At home, there would be embraces and the peculiarly hard work of joy, making room for absence inside presence, speaking names that had no answer, placing a photograph on a shelf and dusting it with the same care as a living object. There would be walks to fields that had waited without complaint, to rivers that had minded their own business, to the edge of a wood where larks might rise the way laughter does when it remembers how. There would be nights when sleep came like a friend, and nights when it paced the hallway and would not come in. Mornings when the light fell across the table in precisely the way it used to. Afternoons when a hammer striking a nail in the neighbor's yard would bring the body to attention before the mind had a chance to say, "It's only a hammer." Mikhailo knew already how to live among such echoes. He had carried a war and kept a person alive inside it. Now he would carry a peace and keep that same person from dissolving into the very quiet he had long wished for. He would measure days not by barrages, but by simple tasks: mending a fence, repairing a hinge, helping his mother sort the good grain from the chaff with a practiced wrist. He would teach the breathing he had learned to a nephew too small to know why his uncle sometimes watched the window light as if it were a verdict. He would keep, in a box with letters and a ribbon and a small piece of Zaraya's collar, the half-card of a farmhouse. Some evenings, he would take it out and hold it near the lamp and try to imagine the other half meeting it, the pencil lines aligning, the path turning back toward a door. As for the world, it would begin its next work. Treaties signed with careful hands in crowded rooms, speeches made under chandeliers, promises written in clauses that would hold and fail by turns. New countries would polish new names. Old grievances would go underground and learn new languages. In schoolrooms, children would open books that described the war in maps and dates. On shelves, souvenirs would gather dust and meaning. In squares, stone memorials would hold rained-on names in alphabetical order so that grief, at least, could find a sort of arrangement. Alive, he wrote on a postcard the first time he found a pen that did not scratch. Just that. It was not everything, but it was enough to start with. Later, he added more. The fields are as I remember them. The bread is better than at the front. The dog at the mill let me pet her. I sleep sometimes with the window open, and when the wind comes, it smells like the river. I think of all the boys. I keep their names. The clock, rehung, began to move in a way that felt true. Not fast, not slow, just steady. At night, he lay on his back and listened to the old house make the sounds of an animal at rest, a beam settling, a kettle sighing as it cooled, a moth testing a lampshade. He breathed the way he had taught himself to breathe. In, gently. Out, longer. When sleep came, it was not a surrender, but a return. The world had changed forever. That sentence could frighten, or it could comfort, depending on when you said it and how. Mikhailo chose to let it be a simple truth spoken softly, like a good night. He closed his eyes and pictured the field where he had once shared bread with an enemy who was only a boy. He pictured the farmhouse on the card, the lamp in the smudged window, the path turning home. And with that image held lightly in his mind, he let the long, hard years loosen their grip, felt the future ease, just a little, into a shape the heart could hold. Time has carried us across a vast landscape of sorrow and endurance. Now we step away from the clang of locomotives, from the glare of artillery, from the endless arithmetic of loss. We slip into quieter space, where memory settles like snow and melts into water that nourishes what will grow next. The Great War showed humankind how quickly a whole world, built by generations, can vanish in the span of 4 winters. Stone cathedrals that had weathered centuries crumbled in an afternoon. Families whose names filled parish books for 200 years found their line broken in a single telegram. Dreams, fashioned in cafes and classrooms, were rewritten in mud and wire. Yet here you are, breathing gently in a room that is calm, in a night that is kind. Your pulse answers a rhythm older than any empire, older than any gun. It is the same rhythm that beat in Mikhailo's chest when he pressed warm bread to his face. The same rhythm that whispered through the half-card drawing of a farmhouse window glowing in the frost-bright dawn. Slowing the tempo picture a pendulum, swinging wide at first, the frantic arc of mobilization, the storm of battles, the restless churn of nations in revolt. Now the arc narrows, smaller, smaller, until the pendulum becomes a gentle sway, and finally, a stillness. Hold that stillness in your mind, the way a candle holds a flame, steadily, softly, without hurry. With each breath, imagine the flame becoming steadier, the air around it quieter, until the sound of your own breathing is the only wind in the room. Philosophical reflection. What is a world, if not the sum of countless ordinary mornings? One generation plants orchards, another gathers fruit. Between those seasons lies the possibility of storm, yet also the certainty of sunrise. War reminds us that the structures we call permanent are in truth agreements written on water. But it also reveals the deeper permanence of simple kindness, a shared crust of bread, a scarf wrapped around a comrade's throat, a letter that travels farther than any shell and delivers a single living word, alive. The darkness of 1914 to 1918 teaches a paradox, that the more fragile civilization appears, the more fiercely the human spirit tends its fragile garden. And so, the lesson lingers in hidden corners, in every hospital corridor lit against fear, in every factory whistle that calls hands together for purpose rather than destruction, in every lullaby hummed beside a crib that might one day hold a leader or a poet or simply a soul at peace. Connection to the present. Tonight, you lie in a bed warmed by electricity that once powered shell factories. You walk streets paved by men who came home and needed work and found it in rebuilding shattered towns. You sip coffee whose beans travel safely across oceans once prowled by U-boats. And each quiet evening you enjoy, each dusk unbroken by sirens, is a gift the fallen never received. Listen. Beneath the city's modern hum, there is an older echo. Cobblestones remember boot heels that never returned. Bridges remember convoys that rattled toward frontiers that no longer exist. Trees in public squares remember ribbons tied when the news was good, black crepe when it was not. But the echo does not demand sadness. It invites gratitude for the lamp that glows without blackout curtains, for the blanket free of trench mud, for the loved ones who breathe beside you instead of in your letters. Repetition of soothing images. Warm bread, soft scarf, slow breath. Let those three images repeat like waves on a sheltered shore. Warm bread, rising, fragrant, proof that hunger can be answered. Soft scarf, wool at the neck, proof that cold can be gentled. Slow breath, steady, unforced, proof that life, having endured, now chooses calm. Again, warm bread, soft scarf, slow breath. Poetic ending, dawn over arresting Europe. Now allow dawn to unfold behind your closed eyes. A pale light seeps into the sky above a continent that has survived its own darkness. Mist drifts over river valleys. Dew beads on grass that was once churned by wheels and hooves. In a village chapel, a single bell rings, tentative at first, then clearer. Its tone glides across tiled roofs and settles on empty fields, no longer competing with the thunder of guns, but harmonizing with the hush of morning. Further west, in a city square, sunlight kisses the bronze helmet of a statue newly erected. Pigeons flutter upward, circle twice, and settle again, unafraid. A baker opens his shutters. The scent of rye escapes into the air and carries with it a promise that ordinary hunger will be met by ordinary bread. Somewhere on a farm that might have been penciled by Sergei's steady hand, a window glows amber against the retreating night. A woman lifts a lamp, sets it on the sill, and steps outside to breathe the cool, clean air. She hears the distant bell. She smells the first wood smoke of breakfast fires, and she feels, though she cannot name it, the quiet gratitude of those who sleep through the dawn because the guns are silent. The sky blushes peach, then gold. The mist thins. The bell rings once more, softer now, as if to say, enough, wake gently. So too, let your thoughts thin like mist. Let the warmth of your blanket be the lamp in that farmhouse window. Let the steady beat of your heart be the bell that keeps time for a world rebuilding itself in silence. Warm bread, soft scarf, slow breath. Again, warm bread, soft scarf, slow breath. Feel each muscle loosen, from the cradle of your neck to the arches of your feet. Feel the bed support you, the way earth supports a seed, asking nothing in return but patience. Feel the future arrive one quiet second at a time, like sunrise slipping across a field. You are safe. You are home. And in this gentle hour before sleep, you carry within you the simplest, strongest memorial to all who endured. A heart that continues to beat, calmly, kindly, bravely, into the dawn. Let the room grow quieter and quieter until the hush itself feels warm. Imagine the earth beneath you, taking one long, peaceful breath, rising a little as you inhale, settling a little as you exhale. Inhale, and let go of worry. Exhale and allow the body to soften. Again, softer now. Inhale, welcome calm. Exhale, release what you don't need. The night is kind. Dawn is far, but certain. A pale ribbon waiting at the edge of the world. Between now and then, there is only ease. Let your forehead smooth. Eyes rest heavy. Jaw unfasten. Shoulders drop. Arms loosen. Hands uncoil. Chest easy. Belly unguarded. Hips heavy and supported. Thighs, knees, calves. Letting go. Ankles, arches, heels, toes. Quiet, quiet. Listen for the simple sounds that mean safety. The soft weight of blankets, the slow ticking of a clock, the faintest hush of air moving through the room. Silence, dawn, the planet's calm breath. They are your companions now. If a thought arrives, greet it gently and set it down, like a cup placed on a saucer. It can wait until morning. Tonight, only breathing. Inhale for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, inhale, gathering warmth, and exhale, loosening every thread of tension. Return to the anchors we've learned. Warm bread, soft scarf, slow breath. Feel warmth at your center, a lantern trimmed low. Feel softness at your neck, a promise against the cold. Feel breath as a tide that only knows returning. Outside, the world is sleeping. The streets, the fields, the rivers. Somewhere a single bell turns in its tower and chooses silence. Mist gathers in low places. Windows glow, then dim. The earth exhales, and you match it easily. Inhale, and let go of worry. Exhale, and allow the body to soften. A little slower now, as if each breath were a hand smoothing linen on a quiet bed. You are safe. You are home. You have come through a long story, and it has set you gently down. Let the future arrive later, the way dawn arrives, without effort, without alarm. For now, rest within these few simple truths. The night is peaceful. Your breath is steady, and the ground beneath you is faithful. If you still feel wakeful, count 3 calm images as you breathe. A lamp in a farmhouse window, a field gathering dew, a bell waiting for morning. On each exhale, let one image fade into softness. Inhale, welcome calm. Exhale, release what you don't need. Again and again, lighter each time, as if the breath itself were carrying you to the shore of sleep. Now receive these blessings quietly. May this night be gentle and still. May your body find warmth and ease. May your dreams bring peace, unbroken and deep. You are safe. You are home. Inhale once more, just enough. Exhale completely. Allow the last edges of wakefulness to loosen, like mist lifting from a field at first light. Good night. Sleep softly. Let the earth breathe, and breathe with it, until dawn arrives and finds you rested, whole and calm.